So what happened when I decided to get the Lumix S5 Mark II? I've been watching all the reviews like I'm sure many of you have, and I was very happy with what I was seeing. The S5 Mark II seemed to have a very vast array of features that I was looking for. Unlimited recording, no overheating. It definitely had the dynamic range, which I was really looking to upgrade my Canon R6 to something that didn't have any dangers of overheating and also improve the dynamic range. That's not to say that I'm not happy with the Canon R6. However, in some instances, if I need longer form shooting, I definitely felt the need to have a bit more safety rather than continuing to rely on either renting and or borrowing other kit for slightly larger jobs, and creatively just needed a few extra tools that it didn't have. So these two cameras that you're seeing on screen now, one is the Canon R6 and one is the new camera that I've just bought, which I will be revealing shortly. So I may flip between the two. They are both on 50mm and it's 1.4 in each, and I will reveal which lenses they are also, I guess, at the end. I thought I had made my mind up and said, yes, this is the camera. The price range is fantastic. The other camera that was in the balance was the Sony A7 IV. I really liked the image quality, dynamic range. However, one of the biggest drawbacks was the crop in 4K 50 or 60. I went to literally the shopping cart. It was in, and there was just something that just kept on going around in my mind about some of the specs that I felt like, I already have a camera that doesn't have a crop in 4K 60 or 50. And I felt, well, I guess I'm getting the longer form shooting. However, it didn't seem like that much of an advantage, even though on paper, the thing that I was looking for mostly was a dynamic range boost and the long form recording. Now, to talk about the dynamic range, I think for any, videographer or cinematographer alike, but dynamic range is definitely a factor. It can make a big difference in certain circumstances. For example, right now, I'm shooting with a massive window behind me, and I'm trying to light for internally whilst also not overexposing. So one of the biggest features of the Lumix S5 Mark II, which you may not think would be a big issue, was how the adapter, the Sigma 21, worked with EF glass. Now, this is a really big deal for me because all of the glass that I have mostly is EF. Now, coming from some micro four thirds, but mostly EF. Even when I bought back in the day the GH5, I really thought, yes, I want to stick with the EF ecosystem because I know I'm not going to necessarily stay in the micro four thirds for that long. So that's one of the reasons I opted at the time for the Canon R6. Now, if you remember, I had the Lumix S5 and R6 about a year and a bit ago now, and I did a couple of tests. And although the R5 definitely beat the Canon in terms of dynamic range, the usability of the autofocus and some of the other features, even though it had, overheating after a certain point in time, which thankfully I've never really come into any issue or problem on. And I've shot in, almost 35 odd degrees here in the UK in summertime. So I think it definitely holds its weight, but that issue is always pending. I cannot stress how important the ecosystem was to my decision making. So cycling around and around some of these options, here were the cameras that were on the list. It was the Lumix S5 Mark II, the Sony A7 IV. Then I saw an amazing deal for a Canon R5 for roughly 3K. It was very tempting. How can I say that, for an extra almost, say, 800, you could get an 8K camera with 4K 120. Obviously, maybe buying some more expensive media cards in order to use with it, but it was particularly tempting. However, it was I believe, a grain-bought camera. So for those of you who know about that, it may carry some issues later on down the line if there were any problems past warranty. Then that raised some more questions. 4K 120. One of the things that the S5 Mark II doesn't have is 4K 120. And from some of the shoots that I've done recently, where the cameras that I was shooting with, some did have it and some didn't, the 4K 120 is definitely a lifesaver, or in PAL, like we were shooting 4K 100. It's definitely a massive tool to have in the arsenal. So to be buying a new camera in 2023 and it still not have 4K 120 or 4K 100, it started to get to me, and I thought, well, okay, maybe this Canon R5 could be the ticket. Now, when it comes to buying cameras, chaos definitely is a ladder, because the minute you go up to one more spec that you think you really do need, there is something else, and then there's something else, and it's a little bit of a never-ending cycle. And then you get to the point where you think, oh my goodness, that's just maxed out. And then in my case, I went then back down to the Lumix S5, thinking, well, it fits what I initially set out for, which is a dynamic range, which in actual fact brings me to Cine D. Now, I use their chart for dynamic range as a pretty good guide. However, it's a little bit, in my opinion, a little bit debatable in some aspects, because with the Canon R6, I had a conversation with one of the guys there talking about the C-Log1 versus C-Log3, and in their opinion, there was no real difference between testing on the image test, the C-Log3 to C-Log1, which I felt it was a little bit unfair to the camera when they were doing its grading. And I would be interested to know whether the same thing applies to the Canon R5, because I edit a fair amount these days with footage shot against the C300 Mark II, C300 Mark III, I think, and the Canon R5, and sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between the two, unless you're maybe shooting with a very high dynamic range backdrop, and or you're not balancing out the lighting. It's a little bit tricky in time to see which is which. So it makes me think that maybe either the dynamic range is slightly better, or the 8K downsampling really does help out in that respects. However, both the R6 and the R5 are around the 10 to 11 range on the actual usable stops, and the Lumix S5 is much closer to, say, the Sony A7S Mark III, and I think in one or two of the modes just slightly fractionally above it. Having said that, I definitely think how you light a scene and craft what's happening in front of the camera is probably going to be more important. However, the run and gun type setup still was a factor. So what camera did I go for in the end?
Alpha.
The Sony A7S Mark III. Indeed, it's been out for a couple of years now. However, I think it's a tried and tested camera. The only thing that I feel that I'm not getting with this camera over maybe say the Canon or the Lumix is maybe the colors, which I do prefer. But don't start commenting, or by all means let me know why you think I'm wrong or right on this issue. I think out of the Canon probably does give you an initial more pleasing look subjectively, if you like that. So I will be testing that. I will be doing some tests with the Sony and Canon, seeing really what the difference is, so stay tuned for that. But ultimately, I think the low light is just phenomenal. Literally, there are times when you're shooting with a Sony where you can continue to shoot, where a Canon will have to stop, basically, and it will be cleaner. And I just think it gives you a bit more flexibility. Yes, you may spend a little bit more time or have to figure out a workflow with color. The only unfair point is I'm using the Mikey drop-in filter adapter, which I think is phenomenal and I do love. And I'm actually for the very first time going back to using filters on front of a camera. So again, if there are any minor color adjustments, that may be an added factor on top, but that's just life when it comes to cameras. The 4K 120, the low light, the durability of the camera, basically the unlimited recording, the fact that I would be able to use my other anamorphic lens without having to buy a brand new camera. So it was literally covering two purposes for one. So whereas if I bought the Canon, I could only get 4K 100 or 120 with the EF glass that I have, and not, the anamorphic lens. Obviously, I can buy more lenses in the future, but I really do like that lens, and if I'm shooting with it, I just wanted to be able to upgrade it all in one package. And if you've seen any of Cam Mackey's videos on his, massive swap from Canon over to Sony, Again, if you see the work that is done and created on Sony users worldwide and Canon, you know, they are all good. So I don't think it's a limitation of the camera at all. It's literally, there is probably some benefits to it, and cameras definitely aren't everything, but without it, if you can't get 120 in something, you can't get it, right? Anyway, that's all for now. Oh, there was one. There's one more things in this video. I put off getting into Sony land so many times. Obviously, I bought the Canon R6, and I wasn't even at the time thinking about the Sony ecosystem, always because I have EF glass. Now, entering into Sony land basically would mean I would have to be buying new lenses at the cost over and over and again, and you'll spend more on the lenses than you will on the camera body. With this Sony, I only bought the 35 1.8. However, I bought an adapter literally before I bought the camera for the purposes of testing. And there are no cameras that I can see out there adapters that do eye autofocusing. So throughout this whole video, I have been using the Sony to track my eye autofocus, and I've used it with so far pretty much 80% of my lenses, and there's only one lens it hasn't worked on so far, but for everything else I am getting eye autofocus. So I'm amazed. So I'm going to do a whole video about that. I'm still doing a bit of testing, but I'm blown away. So not only have I got two use case purposes for my Sony, the A7S Mark III, I now also have up all the lenses that I would say working like native, and that's a bold claim to make, but it almost, I would say, works as good as, if not better in one or two cases, than it does on the Canon. And I'm not sure if that's because Sony's eye autofocus just works, you know, maybe better or slightly better than the Canon's, but frankly, I'm blown away, I'm amazed at the amount of videos I've seen about it. There's one, but it was a really basic video, and thankfully I saw it, and thankfully it's out there. Otherwise, I would not be into this world. I am going to look into the Mikey drop-in filter adapter that I've seen that they do for Canon to EF, Canon EF to Sony EF, because again, this is just one more thing to make the operational use of the camera feel like a bit more like a cinema grade camera, without having these filters all the time, because that's one of the things I was really tempting about sticking with maybe the Canons and going for the R5, is having the drop-in adapter, because it just means that you don't have to be worrying and walking around so many different filters and threads and everything else. It's just a nightmare. So having this is super. So my new adapter, which I will do a video on, I'm loving. So far, I will see how it's done, and this is the first interviewee type, or, you know, piece the camera test, and if it is, that just means that I can use it for my whole ecosystem, and I don't have to worry about buying many more Sony lenses immediately, which I'm sure I will, because in certain use cases it may well work better, but I will go through some testing, and I'm really happy with this 35 1.8. So it was a autofocus range that I didn't have on the Canon, so it kind of made sense getting it for the Sony now, because it's tiny and it will be on a gimbal, and it's so light, it's sharp and crisp. So far so good. Love it. So this has been a interesting experiment, expensive one, and yeah, I'm looking forward to shooting more and reporting back to you all. So I have no idea how long this video is. Thank you for still being with me. As ever, please do like, comment, share, subscribe, all that good stuff, because it sends it up the algorithm. And if you've got anything useful out of this and think other people might, it will help YouTube share it with them also. And frankly, I wish I'd seen a video like this when considering and buying, because most people just talk about the specs, the gear, and the test, which is, you know, phenomenal. But things like the autofocus on the Sony and changing the ecosystem, that for me is a game changer. So yeah, I would love people to know and find out. And, you know, if they want to stick with Canon, that's great. Or if they want to, you know, venture or, you know, buy into Sony, that too is fantastic. I don't think there's any bad cameras out there. Even Nikon, it's a bit of a potato, some people say. But yeah, I'm sure that's all from me. See you all on the next one. Bye now.